So the idea with this carbon management framework is that it's something that is accessible and user friendly. So that's a work in progress. So we're hoping that will be something that moves the dial in terms of actual action. And that's really what I really want to highlight in this, is that it's no use just having this understanding and awareness. We actually need to be doing things differently. And it can start small. It doesn't have to be, these big changes or big, like completely moving away to novel cement products, which I think some people think. But actually, what can we do now with the technology that we already have and the knowledge that we already have? And there is so much that we can do already.
So what is the carbon management framework, and how are practitioners like our guest on this episode moving the needle in the right direction towards reducing carbon emissions in construction? Stay tuned for yet another insightful conversation. Hello and welcome back to yet another episode on the Mission Shunya podcast. Wherever you are, hope you are doing well. First, apologies in a short gap between episodes in this series around decarbonization of the construction sector. Well, I had the episodes and content ready, but just couldn't finish the post-production work required for the release. But not a problem, the episodes are right here, right now. In the second episode in this series, let us dive into the key drivers and enablers in the road to decarbonization of the construction sector. Well, to get to the finer details around this, we would benefit from an expert, a practitioner who has been there, done that, and continues to move the needle in the right direction. So, who's our guest and what's her key focus?
Hi, I'm Tercia Jansen Van Vuuren. I'm a research associate at the University of Cambridge, and I focus on sustainability in the construction industry. My background is in structural engineering. I'm a professionally registered structural engineer, but I now work in the academic sector.
So, when I thought about having this topic around decarbonization in the construction sector, I thought you'll be a perfect fit, because for someone who's worked on ground in the construction sector and then pursued various courses and a master's degree in sustainability, I think you perfectly fit what is actually required in this conversation. So how did you actually get started with construction sector and then moving on to kind of doing the sustainability part of construction? So how did this journey happen?
Well, I started with a strong interest in engineering. So I went to university and studied engineering. I studied civil engineering, which, if you know what that encompasses, is actually quite broad in terms of where you can go in terms of it, with specialization. You can go into structures or bridges, or you can go into water and hydraulics or geotechnical. So it's really broad. And when I finished my degree, I wasn't quite sure exactly where I wanted to specialize, but for some reason I knew that I really wanted to work on site. I always loved that practical side of it, of wanting to be on site. And that led me down the route of becoming a structural engineer and working on really large construction projects. But I always had this interest in sort of the sustainability side. And now I studied over a decade ago. And I think the way that we see sustainability happening in the construction industry has really changed over that time. So in the beginning, I remember colleagues would tell me like, well, why are you even interested in sustainability in construction? That doesn't really matter. That's only the architects who do that. But I was really always passionate about it, and ended up, like you said, I did my master's in sustainability, and even through my thesis, I focused on how this applies in the construction industry specifically, and then have gone on to become a specialist sustainability consultant in construction, and that's looking at from the client side, looking at strategies. And even down to the projects and contractors on actual projects and how they implement the principles of sustainability.
That's wonderful. As you rightly said, so right from when you started with civil engineering, and then in this period has also seen like the transition, or like the understanding of what actually sustainability is, especially in the construction sector. And I think there is more light now on the construction sector and people talk about it in a way that says like, okay, the entire sector is a major emitter of carbon emissions directly or indirectly. So how big is the problem? On what scale are we talking about?
You're absolutely right, Garish, in that I think even if you look at 10 years ago, if you talked about carbon in the construction industry, most people wouldn't really know what you were talking about. It wasn't really high up on the agenda, especially not at sort of board or strategy level. But now it's absolutely right up there as a top priority. Almost every large construction company will have some sort of net zero strategy or commitment, and we've really seen a drastic shift in that. And like you said, like just how much of a problem is it for the construction industry? And I think actually before we get into that, we need to take a step back and look at, well, what do we mean by the construction industry? Because I think a lot of people, if you say that, think, well, actually you're only talking about the construction of the project. So, the construction phase. But we actually need to take a step back and look much more broadly than that. We need to look at what we talk about, the whole life across the full project spectrum. So looking at from the materials that are used and where they're being sourced and the processes in that, all the way through that construction process, but then also through the operation and maintenance phase, and then end of life, what happens at end of life. And then even beyond that, looking at the users and how, as users, we interact with buildings and infrastructure. And all of that has an impact on carbon emissions. So if you think about a road, you've got the materials that you use to use the road. You've got the trucks that are transporting the materials to the site. You've got the concrete and the steel that might be going into sort of a bridge structure. But then you've also got the cars and the trucks that might be using that road and the emissions associated with that. So the scale and depending on where you get your figures, and depending on sort of where you set your boundaries, the impact can be enormous. So some statistics will say, infrastructure is responsible for 70% of global emissions. And that's sort of, if you look at the full spectrum of the influence, including surface transport and that. But even if you just look at materials, concrete and steel are two of the most important materials that we use in the construction industry all over the world. And concrete alone, cement production alone is responsible for between 4 and 8% of global carbon emissions. So it really is such an important sector.
Perfect. And as you said, the entire life cycle of the sector has to be looked at it. And there are a lot of stakeholders, a lot of activities that directly or indirectly contribute to the so-called figures for the entire construction sector. But as we have seen in the last few years, and as more and more climate conferences are happening, and post Paris 2015, I think there is a lot more emphasis, and governments are in fact pledging to reduce emissions. So when we talk about the decarbonization in the space, you have worked as a consultant and you have experience of being on ground. So what do you think are the key strategies that kind of go into the, say, a decarbonization roadmap for someone in the construction sector?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it really depends who you are and where you are in a project. Your ability to influence the actual carbon emissions can look quite different. But I think the really important thing to note is that everyone can do something regardless of who you are and where you are. So if you think of, if you're an owner or operator, an asset owner, or a client, you have significant influence in terms of how you set up the scope, in terms of what's the ambition, what do you put into your procurement about targets around decarbonization? How do you make sure that those commitments filter down across the supply chain? And if you think of the ICE, which is the Institution of Civil Engineering in the UK, have what's become sort of a very famous figure that they've included in sort of their PAS. That's been included in PAS standards. It's a reduction curve, and it looks at your opportunity for influencing decarbonization of projects is highest at the beginning. So at the earliest stages of a project, so you can have significant influence on the amount of carbon that's emitted. But as the project progresses, as the detail becomes more defined, your scope for reducing emissions really decreases. So by the time you get to the design, the detailed design stage and onto construction, your ability to influence really is much smaller, because by the time you get to that stage, you're really looking at sort of optimization, design optimization, or like slightly different materials. Whereas in the beginning, that's where you have like your blue sky thinking in terms of, how can we do, what can we do radically different with this project, that was able to meet society's needs, but, within planetary boundaries, and that kind of thing. So even when you get down to the detailed design and construction, there's so much that you can do, even around seemingly simple things like waste management, understanding what processes in your project are causing waste, where those are coming from, and what is your strategy for dealing with that. So there's a concept called circular economy, instead of having a linear process, looking at sort of how can we have circularity. And I think even in the modern construction world, we just see such a high amount of waste of materials. So looking at efficiency in your processes, whether that's in material takeoff and quantity takeoff, delivery scheduling, and even on-site processes and handling to reduce breakage or waste in the construction processes itself. So that's something that you can do without any new technology, without moving to novel materials that might cost more. And these things, actually, you need to be thinking of it. It's a carbon saving, but more than that, it's a huge cost saving if you can reduce your waste.
Yes, that's actually a valid point, especially during the later stages. I think it's more not about carbon saving, as you said, it's more about the cost saving. But the one question that I have is, like, when people commit to doing this kind of transition and the roadmap, they say, okay, we will look at it in the operational phase. We will get there. How much of it is really effective? Because I think by the time they get to that phase, generally in like most projects, they might probably lose interest, lose track. How do you think kind of stakeholders are really ensuring that that transition is also happening the way it was originally envisaged? I guess people are kind of more aware of it now, but are there any other ways in which, are there any checks and balances in place to ensure that that is also happening?
Yes, it's a really good point, because I think this is where we need to make sure that incentives are aligned. So what we often see in the construction industry is a misalignment of incentives in terms of the way a contractor is set up. The contractor will have the handover, the project handover at project completion, and there'll be a defects liability period. So, for example, 12 months, and within that 12-month period, if anything happens, the contractor is liable for fixing it. But beyond that, there's no incentive for the contractor to have really well-designed, operating systems that are at the lowest life cycle cost. And so this is where it's really important, even in the initial stages of contractor procurement, looking at how are the incentives aligned to make sure that everyone who's working on the project is doing the best that they can possibly do to make it a low carbon, low cost over the full life cycle, and not just upfront cost and upfront carbon. So looking at how do we get those mechanisms in place to ensure the best value over the full project life cycle.
Perfectly leads to the next discussion point, because you mentioned about contractors and having their interest also aligned in the overall objective. So there are, of course, challenges, because any decarbonization effort in any sector has its own challenges, because there are a lot of stakeholders, their own interest, and a lot of challenges that come over a period, and construction being a vast sector with so many stakeholders that, like we spoke earlier. So in this transition, which is the hardest part? Who's hard to move or who's hard to nudge in this transition in terms of stakeholder mapping?
Oh, yeah. I think if you'd asked me this sort of 10 years ago, I would have thought like, it's really hard, because it's really hard to get the clients on board, because you have to demonstrate, because all they're worried about is, the cost, time, quality, like the original triangle. But we're starting to see a shift in values and understanding the importance of carbon. And I think you can really make it happen when people get why it matters and get how they can have an influence. So that's I think the first and the biggest thing that needs to be unlocked is that motivation. So why are we doing this? Why does that matter? And when people get that, when clients get that, and when clients understand that, they're willing to engage, and they're willing to look at, investigate different options, and you sort of have that, you're on the same team then in terms of trying to overcome challenges. So not trying to be antagonistic in how you approach it, but trying to make sure that you're all heading in the same direction. And so that is the biggest challenge, is getting that motivation right. But in terms of delivery, I think a really big challenge we see in the construction industry, like I said, with the misaligned incentives, it's just the fragmentation. So there's just so many different moving parts. If you think of, you've got the product or material suppliers, and they're operating in their world. And then you've got and again, this is different around the world depending on where you are. But particularly in the UK, we've got, many tiers of suppliers. And there's such limited visibility all the way down that supply chain. And at each stage there's fragmentation in terms of they have their own sort of procurement and their own suppliers, and then that moves up the chain. So at the end, the client or the main contractor doesn't really have total visibility over what's happening in their project in terms of materials or cost or labor or anything like that. So trying to have that, the need for decarbonization has to filter down then at every single step and translate from one like the relationship between the client and the main contractor, and between the main contractor and the second tier contractors, and between the second tier contractors and their product suppliers. And so just getting that cascade right is incredibly challenging.
That's interesting. And I want to pick your brain on this point again, because you have an international experience working in multiple countries, different stakeholders as a consultant. So the easiest thing that people generally talk about is like, one is like, okay, you have to have the regulations. Okay, you have to have the certifications and all those things. And the other interesting thing that it's very clearly visible is because of novel materials, new materials that kind of get good traction in the media. A lot of people are aware about it and all this thing happening. So are these like really positive enablers in an overall way?
Yes, I think you get lots of different schools of thoughts on this. And my personal view is that these exercises in terms of, like green building certifications and BREEAM ratings and stuff like that, they have their challenges in that they can be very much a box checking exercise where you're just sort of trying to do the minimum possible. But at the same time, it's a way to have the conversation with people who might not even be willing to have the conversation at all. And once you have that baseline, then you can start to introduce even more, ambitious approaches or methods or something like that. So it really it's a starting point. But I think the problem is when we see it as the ceiling of this is the ultimate of what we could be doing, when actually it's the foundation, and we should be seeing it as a bare minimum and then beyond. I listened to a talk by someone who was talking about this exact thing in California, I think it was, where they have the LEED building standards. And she mentioned that, I can't remember how many years ago, so say a decade ago, it was, they just started introducing LEED and stuff. But now actually the building standards in, I think it was California, have advanced such that their building regulations and building standards now are aligned to that, basic level of LEED. So you can't even build a building without it being at least that LEED basic level. And I think that's how we can see that's how we see these sorts of mechanisms and certifications as, moving the conversation forward and driving change in the sector. But yeah, it is challenging because of the way that it can be really sort of box checking.
Yes. I mean, it's actually interesting that you gave that example. That reminds me to ask you this. So is it now safe to kind of say that when we look at decarbonization in the sector, it is happening both at the top and also at the bottom? So the approach from the top, like having all the policies, regulations also help. And on the bottom level, like individual consumers, individual stakeholders on ground, even they are keen to kind of get their actions aligned with the top. Is it safe to say that it's happening both ends?
I think that would be a safe assumption to say. And I think we really are seeing sort of the awareness and the need for better regulation and better policy. So in the UK, there's a movement called Part Z, which is in the UK, we have different building regulations that cover different parts of a building. And so they want to introduce a new building regulation called Part Z that mandate whole life carbon measurement in buildings. And this is like where we see, things changing at policy level, as well as, on the ground at like you said, like starting from the bottom up. Another thing that we're really seeing driving the awareness and the need for carbon understanding in industry, and this is across the board, so regardless of any industry, but it definitely impacts the construction industry, is the need for mandatory reporting, for mandatory non-financial reporting requirements. So things like the Task Force for Climate-related Financial Disclosures. In the EU, they have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And that's, like I said, this is not just for the construction sector, it's for everybody. But these large organizations do need to start being noting their risks and their impacts related to for climate related risks and impacts, but specifically carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions is a large part of that. And in the construction industry, you might have heard of scopes of emissions. So scope 1 and 2 is your direct company carbon emissions, but scope 3 is sort of what happens along your supply chain, both upstream and downstream, so consumer and suppliers. And I think in the construction industry, this is where 80 to 90% of our impact is in this scope 3. Look at the materials that we use in the processes, transportation, and then the users of the products inverted commas, the buildings and infrastructure that we supply. So it is so important as construction sector organizations to be aware of our impact and to be managing them and doing what we can to reduce in the broader scope, not just within our own organizations.
This is good. This is good. So, like in terms of enforceability, how do you think this is going to be enforced?
So it depends. Again, it depends in different parts of the world. There are different mechanisms. So in the United States, they have things like the SEC, and in the EU they have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And to trade or operate within the EU, you will have to comply with these requirements. And then this filters down to other regions in the world and how they implement and how they apply it. So there is no one size fits all. But you see, I think we're seeing a lot of voluntary reporting. So even when it's not required, that companies are reporting on these voluntarily and building up the expertise, building up the capacity, so that one day when it does become mandatory for them, when their governments bring in requirements, that they are already doing, or they are already equipped and capable of responding to those requirements.
That's nice. That's actually good, because I think hopefully eventually it'll happen in a way that, say, for example, ESG reporting is kind of mandatory and a lot of companies are voluntarily doing this. So I think, as you said, scope 3 and other emissions, if all that kind of gets in, I think this will fall into the right framework and eventually everything will be accounted well. So that's good. So Tercia, on a final note, if I were to ask on a professional level at this point, are there any interesting projects or any activities that you think that we should be aware that kind of you think is moving the needle in the right direction?
Well, when you asked me about this, Girish, it was really interesting because I'm actually working at the moment on an initiative that FIDIC developing, and FIDIC is the International Federation for Consulting Engineers, and they've really seen a gap in terms of the people who are like we've spoken about, like willing and interested and aware of the problem, but actually needing to take that step to action, but don't know how to do that. So then you might have a project or be working on a project, but not know how to actually apply these principles. And there's a wealth of information online, and it's just the problem now is actually that it's just overwhelming. If you just Google what do I do about carbon on infrastructure, it's just overwhelming. So FIDIC are working on something called the Carbon Collaboration Initiative, and they're developing the Carbon Management Framework. So that's a project that I'm involved in with them in terms of creating a portal for managing carbon, and it's specifically on infrastructure projects. But the idea is that it will be a global one, and it will be applicable to all stakeholders. So not just consulting engineers, not just clients, but looking at all stakeholders. So we have got an international standard called PAS 2080 for carbon management in infrastructure and buildings. But the tricky thing with that is that it can be really overwhelming and, like I said, inaccessible. So the idea with this carbon management framework is that it's something that is accessible and user friendly. So that's a work in progress. So we're hoping that will be something that moves the dial in terms of actual action. And that's really what I really want to highlight in this, is that it's no use just having this understanding and awareness. We actually need to be doing things differently. And it can start small. It doesn't have to be, these big changes or big, like completely moving away to novel cement products, which I think some people think. But actually, what can we do now with the technology that we already have and the knowledge that we already have? And there is so much that we can do already.
That is true. I mean, we have to start now, or rather, it's actually late, but better late than never. So start getting on to act on at least small steps, like you said. I think that's a wonderful, wonderful thought to kind of leave this conversation on. Yes, there is so much we can already do in this space. And as Tercia pointed out, the evolving regulatory landscape is definitely helping. And with new frameworks that the practitioners are adopting, the carbon reduction in the construction sector is definitely happening at a good pace. But there are, of course, challenges. Key among them is aligning all the stakeholders who tend to show slack because the incentives are not clearly defined. And true, carbon emissions of the construction sector don't start and stop at the actual construction phase of the project. Stakeholders are there right from planning to the operation end of the project. So we will leave the conversation here for now. On the next episode, we will have one more key piece in the puzzle of decarbonization of the construction sector discussed in detail. I hope you have hit the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on the next episode, which will be out pretty soon. As always, missionchunya@gmail.com is the ID for all your feedback. The link to connect with Tercia is in the show notes of this episode. Finally, I have to thank Jacob and team Tercia Jansen for all the amazing artworks for the shows. They are a content agency specialized in telling stories in climate, biodiversity, and sustainability. TerciaJansen.com is the website where you can find them. And with that, this is Girish Shivakumar signing off. And as always, thank you for listening.